The house was alive with the sounds of laughter and the clinking of glasses. My family's Christmas Eve gathering was in full swing. Bright lights strung across the living room, the scent of cinnamon and pine filling the air. Everything felt safe, wrapped in the warmth of tradition. But safety can be deceptive. At one point, my aunt called me over. She'd forgotten a box of decorations in the basement and asked if I could grab it. It was a simple enough task, but something about the request tugged at me. Maybe it was the faint unease of descending into the dimly lit basement while the party hummed on upstairs. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer just in case. The basement door creaked as I opened it, the noise swallowed by the sound of distant holiday music. Each step down felt heavier, the air cooler and thicker. Reaching the bottom, I switched on the single flickering bulb. The shadows it cast danced unnaturally against the walls. I scanned the room for the box when something caught my eye. A lump on the couch covered with a blanket. It looked oddly out of place. Probably just some old linens, I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh to break the eerie silence. But as I stepped closer, I realized the lump was breathing. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze in place, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The air felt suffocating now, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the blanket. "Hello?" My voice cracked as it left my throat. No answer. The light above flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a brief, terrifying second. When it came back on, the blanket had shifted. The lump was bigger now, more defined, and then without warning, the bulb went out entirely. The darkness was suffocating. I fumbled with the flashlight, hands trembling. The beam flickered to life, casting a weak light across the room. That's when I saw it, the figure beneath the blanket moving, shifting as if preparing to rise. My instincts took over. I bolted for the stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. But as I reached the first step, a hand shot out from the darkness, gripping my ankle. I screamed, kicking frantically as I tried to break free. The hand was cold and unyielding, its grip like iron. It yanked me back, and I fell hard onto the concrete floor. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the figure, pale, gaunt, and unearthly. Its face was contorted into an expression of rage, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I kicked again, this time connecting with something solid. The grip loosened, and I scrambled up the stairs, throwing the door shut behind me. My family found me moments later, trembling and barely able to speak. When we opened the door to the basement again, it was empty. No figure, no blanket, just the cold, oppressive stillness of the space below. To this day, I don't know who or what was down there. But every Christmas Eve, when the lights flicker or the shadows shift just so, I remember the grip on my ankle and the feeling of being watched from the dark. The holidays felt different this year. It was our first Christmas without Mom, and though my dad tried to keep things cheerful, the emptiness was impossible to ignore. The decorations were a little less extravagant, the music not as loud. Still, he was doing his best. Then came Sydney. She was his new girlfriend, someone he'd met a few months ago. Dad said she was special, someone who might help heal the family. At first, she seemed perfect, kind, attentive, even bringing over homemade cookies the first time we met. But there was something about her that didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it lingered just below the surface. Christmas Eve, the house was quiet after dinner. Dad had gone to bed early, and Sydney stayed behind to help clean up. As I headed to my room, I noticed her standing in the hallway near my dad's office. She was holding his wallet, thumbing through the bills. When she saw me, she smiled, slipping it back into the desk. "Just making sure he has enough for last-minute gifts tomorrow," she said lightly. I nodded but felt uneasy. Something about her tone felt off. Later that night, I woke up thirsty and went downstairs for water. Passing the kitchen, I saw the faint glow of the refrigerator light. Sydney was there, crouched by the counter. She was pouring something into Dad's water bottle, tiny white pills ground into powder. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back into the shadows, heart pounding. The next morning, I couldn't shake what I'd seen. Dad seemed fine, though maybe a little groggy. I debated telling him, but what could I say? Your girlfriend might be drugging you. He'd think I was imagining things. Over the next few days, I started watching her more closely. Sydney had a way of getting into everyone's head, making little comments to plant doubt, creating subtle rifts between me and Dad. She even managed to convince him I'd misplaced some of my own money when I was sure it had been stolen. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, I was on edge. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft creak outside my door. My pulse quickened. I pretended to be asleep as the door opened slightly, casting a thin sliver of light into the room. Sydney stepped inside. She stood at the foot of my bed, her shadow looming in the dim light from the hallway. I could feel her watching me, her breath slow and steady. My heart raced as I lay frozen, barely daring to breathe. "You're a smart kid," she whispered finally, her voice low and chilling. "But sometimes it's better to stay quiet. Families work best that way." She turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. The next morning, Sydney acted like nothing had happened. She smiled, laughed, and even helped cook breakfast. But every time she looked at me, there was a warning in her eyes. I wanted to tell Dad, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. Sydney had woven herself into our lives so carefully, so deliberately. I couldn't prove what she was doing, but I knew one thing. This woman wasn't here to heal our family. She was here to destroy it. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I'd confronted her. But I didn't. Instead, I watched as she continued to manipulate my father, feeling powerless to stop it. That Christmas marked the beginning of a long, silent battle, one I wasn't sure I could win. The house felt warmer than ever that Christmas. Snow fell softly outside, blanketing our secluded home in perfect silence. Inside, the fire crackled, wrapping the room in a golden glow. My parents laughed at some old family story. My younger sister dozed off on the couch, and I felt safe. Completely safe. But the dream was different. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of the wind against the windows. Almost immediately, I was plunged into a vivid dream. I stood alone in our living room. The fire had gone out, and the house was cold. A man stood by the window, his face hidden in the shadows. He tapped on the glass, his head tilting unnaturally to the side, as if waiting for me to let him in. I woke up with a jolt, heart pounding. The room was dark, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. My dad's voice broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I froze. "Hear what?" "Someone knocking." My stomach dropped. He must have been joking, another one of his playful attempts to spook us. But his tone was different, uneasy. I followed him to the living room. The house was silent except for the faint groan of the wind. My mom stood by the tree, clutching her robe tightly around her. "Maybe it was just the wind," she said, but her voice wavered. My dad checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. Still, the uneasy feeling clung to me, refusing to let go. Hours passed and the house settled back into quiet. My parents went to bed. My sister curled up on the couch, and I found myself staring at the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights. The dream kept playing in my mind. The man by the window, the tapping. At some point, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, it wasn't the wind that roused me. It was footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving across the hardwood floor. I sat up, my heart racing. The tree lights cast faint shadows across the room, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the corner. A figure, barely visible, lingering just beyond the light. "Dad?" I whispered, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the silence when I noticed the back door. It was wide open, snow blowing in across the threshold. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a fireplace poker, and crept toward the door. Outside, the snow was pristine except for a single set of footprints leading away from the house. They were deep, spaced far apart as if whoever, or whatever, made them had been running. I followed the trail to the edge of the woods where they abruptly stopped. There were no more footprints, no sign of anyone. Just the still, snow-covered forest staring back at me. The police came later, but there was little they could do. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been inside the house. But I know what I saw. That Christmas, I realized some intrusions leave no trace, except for the ones they carve into your mind. And every time I see snow, I can't help but glance toward the woods, half expecting to see those footprints reappear.